while I've been watching this film, of course, one gets very, very drawn into the narrative, into the storytelling, let's say, strategy. What I took away from it to begin with, of course, was that there are 2 or 3 strains of narrative storytelling. There is your voice, there is the voice of the protagonist, and there's also a kind of fictionalizing of a certain part of this particular docu-essayist film, if one can call it that. I know you have called it that in the past, a kind of essay film format. I want you to speak further, extrapolate some ideas from that about the film as a whole. But I was also drawn to a kind of other fictionalizing that took place. And over here I would reference, though it was quite different, the 7 Moons of Mali Almeida, and the narrative telling over there is about a figure that lives in the afterlife and a figure that lives in the present. There are 2 strains that are always negotiated. But what is interesting is that the landscape has a telling of its own. It's deeply lyrical. It deeply moves one, and of course, as one draws away, from your subject, and I found that very, very often you moved away from the subject, you pulled out the frame, but the more you pulled out, the more one was drawn in. So these are kind of visual strategies I would like you to talk a little bit about, but more importantly, the narrative storytelling, the French individual who we find who's telling the story and the voiceover that exists. I found compelling because obviously Sri Lanka has had an interesting, if not like the rest of South Asia, mottled colonial history. But even preceding that, whether it was the Arab, whether it was the Portuguese, the British, the French, the Tamil, the Sinhalese, all of that I find comes into some kind of trajectory in the film. So please walk us through it, because it was a complicated narrative. On the one hand, you were telling it from the point of view of your experience, and that's how you prefaced this session. You said it was your story also walking through that landscape. But at the other hand, you also tell the story of Bawa, and you tell the story of Sri Lanka in parts that matter to him or to his life. So how complex or complicated, or what was the means by which you wove this story, and maybe how long it took you? So I know these are 3 or 4 questions woven into one, but that is the way in which your film moves and has moved.
I mean, basically the film came together in the edit. So I shot the film in 2019, and then COVID happened, and I had 2 years more or less in which I was sitting at home with the material, with the editor at times, sometimes on my own. And the only thing I knew when I got to Sri Lanka with the crew was that I wanted to make a document that wasn't just a document, wasn't just a documentary. That's all I knew. I didn't know what form exactly. I knew that I wanted to go to certain places, speak to certain people, capture certain landscapes, certain atmospheres. I had certain ideas about shots and her and so on. I mean, everything that you see is things that I did, that happened to me. They're my experiences which are retold through her. So those are the things that I knew. And then I had, whilst I was making the film, when I started to speak to everybody, it is a very complicated story. Geoffrey's story is complicated. Sri Lanka also has a very complicated history. And then on top of that, you have to think that I'm not from Sri Lanka. So I'm an architect, so that's what I have in common with Geoffrey. That's what I'm interested in. But it's not my country. At the same time, I think I have, there was something that drew me to the country and to Geoffrey's work, which is about a larger idea of architecture, not just locally specific. Anyway, so when I came to the edit, it was a very, very long process. I had to put all these things together. And that's when the idea of the essay came in. I realized that in the essay form, I could use different narrative structures to produce and provoke certain ideas, and certain ideas about space and architecture. some things were completely accidental. So, for example, the chapters is quite an interesting story. So at one point I was going to do the voiceover in English. At one point I had a male friend who was going to be Geoffrey, so it was going to be Geoffrey's voice. But eventually I decided that it should be the protagonist, the person who you see on screen, who is not an actor actually, she's an architect. So she's just being herself. And I would write down the script, the voiceover. She was in Berlin at the time during COVID. And so she would receive this in an email. And I'd say, can you please just read it into your phone and send it to me? And I would put the script in a list, number 1, number 2, number 3, number 4, etc. And each one had a title, so just so she knew what that piece of script was. And that's how she read it. 1, opening. 2. And then I thought, wow, maybe that's what I should do. I should just do it in chapters. So sometimes these things happen very accidentally, you don't think about them necessarily. And then, of course, it was the order of the chapters, right, that became important. What do you tell first? What do you tell at the end? What do you tell in between? So that's right. How it came about.
So that chapterizing is interesting. I mean, that was one of the things that drew me in too. It goes between maybe the very structure of your telling the story of the architecture, the buildings themselves. It goes through something quite sensory, such as rain. It goes through maybe, facets that are more functional, which is about the beginning and the middle, such like. But it certainly does take you on a little bit of a journey. And I want to know a little bit more about your chapterizing, because at some point of time you feel that there is a deep chronology involved, and then you realize actually that chronology is much got to do with the sensory aspect of what you were trying to maybe unfold through it. So a little bit about how you structured the chapterizing. And of course, maybe you can start with Outsider, which is almost the conclusive part of your, before Lunuganga comes back into the frame. Maybe from Outsider leading us back in.
Yeah, I mean, it was very instinctive. In the beginning, you have to lay the story, so you have to say who Bawa is. Because you have to assume there's people who will not know who he was. So the beginning is slightly more factual, perhaps, apart from the opening one, which is just about the book. And then as you get to know his work, then kind of more generic questions about architecture are being asked, which are provoked through the things that you see and the experiences that you have in the spaces. So all I knew is that I would start with a river and I would end with the river, and Lunuganga would be the last thing. But other than that, it was also like what works with the image as well. So it's not chronologically historically, so the projects are not from beginning, they're all over the place. It's not actually geographical, even though I tried to kind of, say it is, but it's not. It kind of is. It's more to do with the feeling of what it's like, what I felt was right for the story. And one of the things that was really important in the edit is that I really wanted it to feel like a Bawa building. Wow. So Bawa thought very carefully about sequence. You come in, what do you see? You have a view, you see further, then you walk further. But even as you're entering, there's always surprises and things that you see. There's a very clear sequencing. So I wanted, when I was looking at the timeline, I was thinking, okay, how do I make this timeline like one of Bawa's plans, so that you always have a sense of a view that's coming next. And you have, of course, the sense of the landscape. You're looking out constantly. You're constantly in touch with nature. So those are the kind of decisions, more instinctive, I guess, than kind of very strategic.
Yeah, and that's exactly part of it. So promenade, vista, surprise, that comes in very early on in the film. I was interested in that because as we were talking about it, it made one also think about psychosocial elements, how you actually encounter spaces and how they work on you. Maybe even subconsciously. The protagonist seems to spend a lot of time dreaming and sleeping. That was important, and thinking.
Actually. Yeah.
And I was interested in that because it's, the space really engulfing her and she really embodying different parts of the space through that subconscious. But I was also aware of the fact that you were trying to bring out, perhaps, at least to my eyes, you were trying to bring out the very intersectional nature of architecture. what the spaces do, how they actually negotiate light, shade, and shadow, how there's an effect they have on you. And so I was very, very keen to know about those sort of elements, because obviously when you were writing the script or you were thinking about the image making, we will come back to the image making because that is so distinct, were you also very aware that you had to look at the perspectives of the people experiencing and looking at these buildings while you were making the film? Because that does come up. On the one hand, how Geoffrey Bawa was quote-unquote elitist. On the other hand, maybe the secular parts of his practice and his, architectural work. But at the same time, there were elements that had to do with just him understanding the regional, the regionality of the space, the brick and mortar of the space, how his interest in the vernacular, if you could call it that, I don't know if you would call it that. Earlier in the day, we were speaking about how we shouldn't call him a tropical modernist, but whether the vernacular is more than just the use of brick and mortar, whether the vernacular is also somewhere his sensitivity to the nature of things as he found them in those spaces.
It's what I call the cosmic economy.
Right.
I mean, what I think Geoffrey was extremely privileged, and because of that privilege, he had time, basically. And because he had time, this is my interpretation, I think he had really had the time to think about the spaces and what he wanted to do, which we don't have so much anymore, I feel. And I was trying to show that in terms of the contrast of Colombo and so on. So I also wanted to so I slow things down quite a lot sometimes, go into slow motion, and just to also talk about a different sense of time which is the time that he was working in. It's not the time now, it's a different, that's how I interpret it. I've lost my track of thought.
Well, we can come back to that.
Yeah.
And since you were talking about time, I'll sort of pull the thread in another direction, if I may. Let's just say that the politics of place seem to come in and go out of frame as well in this. And you talk about it at one moment when you reference the fact that Geoffrey never took sides. When it came to that moment, of course, the civil war that went on all the way till 2009, I mean, it did intersect with a lot of what he was building, I guess, in the latter half of his practice, right? But that doesn't necessarily come into play, and maybe that comes back to the intersectional and the secular. I mean, was he really making these spaces as approachable spaces at the time of great political and other upheaval? Also being sensitive to the fact that in more recent times, we have seen the storming of the presidential palace. This is just something that happened recently, right? It was televised all over the world, mediatized as well. But if I'm not mistaken, it was Geoffrey who also restored that building in the 80s in order to give it an afterlife, as he did with the parliament and such like. I mean, such a compelling architect. He sort of built, a lot of what gets recognized in the modern period in Sri Lanka. But do you think, that space really meant to be approachable in the way that we would think about secular architecture today? And I'm also very sensitive to the fact that a lot of the modern architecture we see in the city right now is endangered in many respects. A lot of the works are being destroyed by a vicious drive, which is a political drive. But Geoffrey Bawa is very much part of that, at least for India, very much part of that let's say, lexicon, because he overlaps so interesting with Corbusier in his own time. He overlaps with Raj Reval, he overlaps with B.V. Doshi. These are all architects who are, of course, building works over here. A lot of them had to do with urban planning more than just architecture. They were urban planners, as was Corbusier. But what I'm really asking is about ways in which you found or you think his buildings today are approachable, you think his buildings today are accessible. Because obviously when we come to the end of the documentary, you have that moment where you're asking people where is Lunuganga, where is the space? Everyone is pointing in different directions. You give a sense that there is an emplacement of the architecture there, but it is also something secluded, something of its own.
I mean, he never really wrote about being socially accessible. I don't think that's something that I'm not sure I can talk about that because he never wrote about that. All I can say is that the clients and people that I spoke to, for example, the nuns and the people that he built sometimes for no money, what they tell me is that it's very sad that those buildings, which are very socially accessible, and there are many of them, which I have not included in the film, unfortunately are going into disrepair because there isn't the kind of leadership to keep those buildings going, schools and other public buildings. So often the buildings that we now see of Geoffrey's are private buildings, hotels, his house, and so on. I mean, that's partly why I wanted to show the office building that is kind of derelict and so on. That's a reality of Sri Lanka, unfortunately, that he did build quite a lot of socially accessible buildings, but those are now going slowly into disrepair. I think that his buildings are accessible to everyone, at least materially, because they're simple. And they're delightful, and they are open, and I think in that sense, I think they're accessible, I suppose.
So let's sort of come back a little bit to your, let's say the cinematography, to the image making, to photography, which you bring up throughout, the film. You've also talked about it. You encountered his work through a publication, Lunuganga. Was that the one by Dominic?
Correct. Yeah, correct. Yeah.
So Dominic is just on a more personal note. We had worked on an exhibition on Sri Lanka many years ago here at the National Museum. A lot of the works were from his collection, especially of the work of Lionel Wendt. And of course, Ismat Rahim was someone who wrote the preface to that book. I bring this up because of the moment that we are talking about, a very exciting moment. This is the time where even Laki is part of, I think, the 43 group that gets established. Of course, Lionel Wendt is instrumental in establishing the 43 group, sadly passes away in 44, at the age of 44. But this is the time of George Keat and the works that he was doing, Harold Pieris, who might have been patron, Minute de Silva. I'm very compelled, to ask you about the relationship he might have had with Minute de Silva, and maybe you can tell everyone here a little bit about her as well.
Well, she was hugely influential, Minette de Silva, and in fact, we shot some scenes with an actress who was playing Minette de Silva, because she was instrumental to Geoffrey, and Geoffrey admired her greatly, but they did not get along. And, I mean, I won't go into the story, but essentially...
No, please do go into a little bit of the story.
Geoffrey and Minette shared a lover. And basically, the lover went with Geoffrey as opposed to Minette. And that basically finished the relationship. But she was the one that really started to think about, traditional methods of construction in a modern way. And there definitely needs to be a film about her. And the reason that I did not include the scenes is because I felt that she was then again an appendix to his story. And I felt it just wasn't, I couldn't give her enough space in this film. But she's someone that, we don't know enough about, it's not spoken enough about. And unfortunately, most of her buildings have disappeared.
Yeah, and she made a select number of buildings, is my understanding, as opposed to Geoffrey, who has over 100 buildings.
Over 150 buildings.
150 buildings that he was responsible for, whether he worked with the firm or even when so a lot of the buildings were while he was with the firm, and a lot of the buildings get made when he starts his own firm. I mean, Minute de Silva I bring up over here also, she's interesting in India, because she also, I think, did a fair amount of work in Bombay, worked for a patron by the name of Billy Moria, and then she became a founder of Marg with Mulk Raj Anand. So So I was very, very excited to know, whether that relationship would be teased out. But the reason I bring up the 40s and the 50s and 60s is what I was also looking for in the film, and maybe it appears in subtext, is that modernist moment, which Geoffrey is very much part of. But my understanding is, as you were talking about earlier, is that he didn't ever liked to be...
He didn't like to be termed as a tropical modernist. I mean, he was in the beginning, when he just came from London in the very beginning, he was trying to experiment with, modernism in a tropical manner, or what was termed tropical modernism. But then he saw Minette's work, and he thought, this is much more interesting. And he started to make an interpretation of that. Something clicked when he saw her work. He very quickly realized that the concrete and various forms of construction that were kind of the foundations of a lot of modernist architecture just wouldn't work in Sri Lanka, and he gradually got to learn. But actually, a lot of that turn happened through also Ina da Silva, because the Ina da Silva house is the first house where this occurred, so this change from purely modernist to something more local or regional. Was also influenced by Ina da Silva, who was the client and also an artist. And then Lackey and all these other people, Barbara Sansoni, they were looking at Sri Lanka. And in fact, in the 80s, a lot of his contemporaries, Sri Lankan contemporaries, didn't like what Geoffrey was doing. They thought that he was, wasn't very interesting, and that he should be doing something much more modern, and why we're looking at kind of this, looking back as opposed to looking forward. That's
right. Tell us a little bit about, the archival nature of your research. At the Architectural Association, there's so many overlaps with what you're doing, what maybe Geoffrey was associated with, in the UK. I'm thinking of Maxwell Fry as an important individual who, of course, took over the Architectural Association at one time. His referencing always of the elemental nature of architecture, how it should associate with nature. I'm also thinking, again, I have to come back to Minette, because I think she did a few projects for the Tatars with a gentleman who was, as it were, a refugee from Nazi Germany at the time. So there was a very interesting, group of people and individuals. But you yourself at the Architectural Association were an archivist, were doing archival research. So tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, so I studied at the AA, as did Geoffrey. My understanding is that Geoffrey didn't spend much time at the AA. That he actually spent more time traveling around Italy and, looking at gardens and, and somebody else did his work. He paid someone to do his work. It might be an anecdote. Of course, he must have learned something and he was interested in what was going on. But so his relation to the AA is kind of fluid, let's say. I studied there, and I was... as a student, I worked in the slide library. So a lot of my education has been through photography, through looking at buildings in photographs. And when I was working there, I felt sometimes quite alienated by the kind of photography the photography that is used to document buildings, that I didn't feel was reflective of the experience of architecture. So that was always something that I thought about, and which is why in this film you very rarely see wide shots of buildings, because I tried to shy away from the idea of the building as an object that you just look at from outside. I wanted the camera to be in the architecture, to understand it through details, much more sensual, much more atmospheric.
This is interesting because, as Dominic says in the film, Geoffrey had a Leica M3, and I believe he had a 20mm lens, which is an extremely wide lens. So that's interesting. I mean, did you find sort of material taken by Geoffrey himself? I mean, was he prolific in it?
Yes, he was. He did take a lot of photographs, but actually the Lunuganga book, which was edited by Geoffrey, is full of details. you hardly ever see a wide shot of the landscape. You see it in parts, but mostly it's details of the garden. So, and if you look at Geoffrey's work, it is all about details. There's a lot of, you know, all the objects and all the things that he has, and you sit somewhere and you look somewhere. You know, it's very about the bodily experience, as opposed to a big gesture of a building. I think it's very much an experiential.
So we have to open it out to some of our guests here. But I did want to ask you one last question before we do that. And that is very, very simply about making this film. So I'm sensitive to the fact that it might have taken you very long to garner resources and such like. But tell us a little bit about literally the making of this film, the crew. Who are they? Because obviously...
My friends.
Yeah.
Well, Karina's here. She's a producer. She was absolutely instrumental in making this film. Without her, it...
Let's give her a round.
Please. Please. I mean, I had this crazy idea about making this film, and she said, sure, let's do it. I mean, other people would just run away. So, no, I mean, we arrived in Sri Lanka. It's a group of my friends. We got into a van. We traveled around the country. We shot the material. And then I just sat for a long time editing. That's kind of the story.
Well, it's wonderful to know, and it's an incredible story that you've told. And I'm very, very curious to ask you more about, the Geoffrey Bawa Foundation, their sort of interest in this film, what they make of it, and such like. But maybe we'll now open it up to the audience. So, are there questions that we have? I think yes, just right here.
I don't need a mic.
Yeah, it's better for the record.
It makes me I feel very intimidated. Yeah. Okay, I'll try to be as loud as I can. I actually joined in the middle when we came. It was really full, so we couldn't really watch the entire film. So I will be speaking from what I've seen, the parts that I've seen. I had two questions. One is that, at one point of my life, I've also liked Baba's work. I have liked his style of drawing and all of that, and I was very sort of inclined towards his way of doing things. But as slowly and gradually I started knowing more about how politics plays out eventually in the 5 years of studying architecture, urban design. One thing what really sort of stayed with me was that I see architects, landscape architects, artists, all these people who are sort of working with a sense of, of creating something. I see that a lot of times when we are trying to understand architecture or space, we go back to these people. We go back to some artist, we go back to some architect, we go back to all these people who have created these spaces. In that sense, when I was looking at the film, correct me if I'm wrong, but I couldn't see, I was just wondering what it would have been like if the experience of the space would have been asked to the people who were using the space on an everyday basis, the people who were living around it, and how that would have changed the idea or this interpretation of what is the experience of the space. Because I understand that there is this idea of light and shade and of this texture and materiality, but all of this seems so alienating to people who actually use it on an everyday basis. So just wanted to ask you that did you do this sort of experiment of asking people around and what actually the space meant for them? Because that is question number one. Second is, he was, I think, talking about the political scenario of the country, and I was constantly thinking about things that are happening in India, and I could go back to HCP, which is a very big urban design architecture firm in India, and they are getting a lot of big urban design and architecture projects, and mostly are in correlation to to beautifying spaces around temples, spaces around religious sort of precincts. So in that way, I can also see how HCP, in some sense, is sort of trying to, again, use architecture as a way to sort of, I can see it in relation to cultural hegemony, in the way whose culture are we trying to sort of unfold in this space. In that sense, if I talk about Sri Lanka, I'm sure so the minorities are the Tamils and the Muslims in the country. So I'm constantly going back and thinking, when we use the dichotomy between tradition and modernity, and when we go back to tradition, whose tradition are we talking about here? Because from what I remember, I can see that there has been a lot of influence of the Portuguese, of the Britishes, and of the Sinhalese, but there has been no talk of what it would have meant to sort of understand the word tradition from the perspective of a Sinhali, what would have from the perspective of a Tamil, from the perspective of a Muslim. So in that sense, what is this idea of culture we are trying to go with? In that, so that was the second question.
Can you remind me what the first one was? Just very quickly. I had an answer for the first one, but I just...
I was asking that I saw that you talked to a lot of artists and architects. And Right. So, no, that's... Yeah. So, I mean, we tried, of course, to interview the people who are in the spaces, right? Now, if you think about the spaces that we shot, Bawa's house, I can't really interview Bawa. Sunetra Bandaranayke's house, I interviewed her. Okay, I understand that she comes, she's a particular kind of person. And then the only part of the reason why I went to shoot Bandarawela is because I wanted to speak to the nuns. This was one project that was a public building, and is one of many, many projects that he built with the nuns. And there were nuns who were willing to speak to me. So this was the one opportunity I had. So I did try, but it wasn't always easy to find someone who wanted to speak about it. At the end of the day, I can only speak from my own perspective. I can't speak for the Tamils or for the, Yeah. So, I mean, I was observing, and I was trying to see how buildings are inhabited, the Kandalama Hotel being one of those examples, the girls in the church, I mean, these are things that I can only show what I see and, what I experience, which is not anybody else's experience, it's my experience. And then you can choose to interpret that how you like. But as part of that experience, I am trying to speak to as many people as I can to understand what they think of Bawa's work.
The second question was about architecture and cultural hegemony, if you want to just speak to just a few...
Yeah, so I think that, the architecture that Bawa built is very much his heritage, which is a mixed heritage. That's what he built. He's Dutch, he's half German, he is Sinhalese, he's Arab. He's really a product of that colonial Sri Lanka. He is a colonizer, but he's also been colonized. It makes him very, very complicated as a person, And his architecture is like that, is very layered, is very complicated. I'm not trying to defend him. I'm not trying to say he's like, a god or anything, but what interested me is that complicated history. That's what interested me about him, that it's not a straightforward, and that he was an outsider, and that he is seen as an outsider, and so on.
I think we have time, of course, for one more question. But why don't you pass? Let's. Thank you.
Thank you, Clara. Along with him, I also felt minute was a missing element. and Minute was, took a political position. Association with Mulk, apart from Marg, was also IPTA, the Indian People Theatre Association, which took political position. I look forward, perhaps your next project might be the film on Minute. Two quick questions on Bawa. That he didn't take a position, but the fact is that his partner, at least for some period of time, was from Jaffna, at Tamil. And Jaffna was one of those that. So I'm curious to know that even in a private space or a private moment, did he say anything at all about the unfolding situation? That's one. The second was the last one on Lunuganga, where he said, he has left a written record where he said that if something happens to me, something should happen to me, then let the jungle, kind of take over, except for that very, very neatly trimmed lawn space. Now, therefore, in the course of building, and really taking, did he feel that he was intruding? He was trying to blend with nature. You cannot associate Bawa with dynamite or with blasting rocks the way the Kandalaba has been conceived. But that in this building, did he feel that he'd intruded? That he had intruded into what was rightfully nature space or the jungle space, and that, that it was a period of time and space, and let later jungle take over. I was curious on that. Thank you so much. Thank you.
Do you want to ask your question, and that might...
Well,
So we just take
there's Minute and then there's Bevis.
Yes, no, that's true.
So that was the other very interesting thing that I missed in the film, because there is this idea of Minute being something that he kind of sees for a minute and then perhaps actually grasps a lot of her more than what is written about. And it's the same thing with his brother, Bevis, because Bevis builds his own garden 10 years earlier, and there is that completely unwritten history, or very little is written about the possibility of him being inspired by Bevis and how that transacts. So that was just a comment. But quick question, Rahab, did you mean to use the word elitist or elite? Just a clarification in describing him.
How long ago was that? It depends on the timeline.
I was just curious whether that was something that was conscious.
Okay.
Describing him as elitist or elite. Did you mean that?
I probably meant versions of both, yes.
Okay. Yeah. And I think that just to respond to him, this idea of him invading this space, I think what's important to know is that this was a rubber plantation. There was nothing more colonial than that. Sure. And the fact that he actually disses that, he cuts it out, the remunerative value of that, and he, overlays that with the garden, is, I think, interesting, and I think gives us some insight into him.
I think you were there at the 75th anniversary of the gardens, where they opened up the gardens to everyone. And there were 5,000 people that came in one day, from all around the villages. So they feel if it's theirs, it's part of their landscape, part of their story.
But that's recent, and that's just once a year. One day in a year, 3 days in a year.
So he wanted the rubber plantation for himself.
Yeah, that's very recent. Yeah, of course. Yeah.
But please speak to... did you meet Geoffrey? Did you have...
I never met Geoffrey.
Okay. So, and vis-a-vis the second question, did you ever feel, while reading about him or listening to people, whether he himself felt that he was trespassing in his own space into this natural sort of...
I think he thought very carefully. He spent so much more time designing Lunuganga than any other project, so he liked working with nature, and he respected it greatly. There's that scene of in the voiceover where one of his friends crashes into the roof of the building, the microlight. And the anecdote is that he crashed into the roof because if he crashed into any of the trees, Geoffrey would be very angry.
Also, it was interesting what they shared at that gathering, that he didn't know anything about the plants. He was using them purely for their decorative, ornamental value, and that's interesting.
Correct. So, I mean, part of the reason why it's also in black and white is because he wasn't interested in the colors so much. He was really interested in the textures and in the form. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
So thank you, Clara, very,
Thank
very
you.
much. Warm hand. And before you said you're at the very end of your previewing and showing of this film. So where have you been and what's next?
Oh.
As we end. Where all have you shown your film? I know you've, yeah, go on.
Corinne might need to help me with this, but it premiered in New York, which was fantastic, and I've shown it in London. I just came back from DIF recently in Dharamshala. It's been in many places: Korea, New Zealand, Canada, various cities in the United States. It's showing in France this week. It's shown in Portugal, in Spain. Anyway, I've shown it in many places.
So it's wonderful to know that it's traveling, and maybe we come back to that other question as to why this protagonist is French. Yes.
It's totally accidental, by the way.
Well, that's how films are made then.
You want to know that story? Okay. So remember how I was telling you I was sending her the script? And she said she was having a lot of, she was going to read it in English. And she says, I'm just finding it really difficult to read in English. I said to her, okay, well, just translate it into French, think about it in French, and then, then you can feel the words a bit more, and then read it in English. And so then she slightly misunderstood, and she sent me 2 recordings, one in French and one in English. And obviously the French one was much nicer. And that's why it's in French.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone, and thank you, Clara.